Welcome. You're here because you want to cut through the noise, get a real grip on the big global shifts, fast, but, with actual depth.
Exactly. And today we're diving into what feels like a genuinely crucial moment. This is 2025.
Right. It's this confluence of things happening all at once.
Mhm.
Renewed American protectionism, this ongoing rise in global nationalism.
And then the real curveball, this unexpected election of an American pope. It's quite a mix.
It really is. So we've got a couple of key sources we're looking at. One, analyzing these interconnected trends.
And another piece that digs into the potential fallout, specifically from Trump's tariff threats making a comeback.
Okay, so our mission today, pull out the core insights, connect these dots for you, and really try to map out this new global landscape and, well, what it might actually mean.
Sounds good. There's a lot to unpack. Where should we kick off?
Well, maybe the logical place, as our first source suggests, looking inside the U.S. first. This whole evolving political climate and this term some scholars are using, new fascism.
Yeah, that term definitely makes you sit up. New fascism. The article is pretty careful, though.
How so? What are they actually flagging?
Well, it stresses this isn't, a carbon copy of 1930s fascism. No brown shirts marching, no full-on totalitarian state. Not like that.
Okay, so what is it then?
It's more about an erosion, a wearing away of democratic norms, maybe?
Yeah.
More rhetoric that gets dangerously close to inciting violence.
Right.
And things like negative partisanship, where you mostly define yourself by who you hate, politically speaking, plus personality cults around leaders, and this sort of gradual decay of institutions, the guardrails.
So less a sudden grab for power, more like rust, a slow weakening from within.
That seems to be the idea. But the source does point out, the U.S. system isn't exactly fragile. You've got federalism, the courts, civil society. Checks exist.
But there are weak points.
Definitely. Things like making election administration itself political at the state level, attacks on government agencies, making them seem biased. Some experts call it pre-authoritarian, that slide.
And this isn't just happening in the U.S., right? The source mentions Europe.
Exactly. And that's crucial. You see this sort of transatlantic echo. Populist right parties, they're not just on the fringe anymore. They're in governments across Europe.
That Wall Street Journal survey from May 8th hinted at that, didn't it? The traditional center-right losing ground.
Precisely. And figures like Meloni in Italy, Le Pen in France, they champion these more nationalist, less, let's say, traditionally liberal ideas. It feels like a broader shift in the wind, definitely not confined to America.
Okay, so we've got these internal shifts. Now let's connect that to this America First idea coming back. Foreign Affairs called it the age of American unilateralism. What does that actually look like in practice?
This is where the second source gets specific. It lays out Trump's proposed trade plan, and it's, well, quite punchy.
Meaning?
A baseline 10% tariff on almost everything imported. Just imagine a 10% hike on tons of stuff you buy.
Wow, okay, universal 10%.
Plus, much higher targeted ones, up to, I think, 115% on certain things, Chinese goods, steel, cars. Combine that with big cuts to foreign aid, a very transactional what's in it for me. Diplomacy. Yeah, the message is pretty clear. America going its own way.
And America's traditional allies. They can't be thrilled. How are they reacting?
Understandably, they're recalculating. CSIS, the think tank, suggests NATO and the EU are quietly working on hedging strategies.
Hedging, like backup plans.
Yeah, basically. Trying to reduce reliance on the U.S. economy where they can limited decoupling, it's called, and boosting their own independent defense capabilities.
So trust is eroding.
That's the feeling. Trust in the long-term reliability of U.S. commitment seems to be waning. It really makes you wonder about the future shape of these alliances, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If your main partner seems less reliable, you start looking elsewhere. It makes sense. But what's driving this protectionist push inside the U.S. again?
Our first source points to some Brookings data here, which is quite revealing. It shows a strong link between areas that really back these tariffs in communities where wages haven't really grown for decades.
So economic stagnation plays a big role.
A huge role. It creates this potent mix of economic frustration and often cultural anxiety. And that's something a message of treat nationalism can really tap into effectively. These aren't just abstract policies.
No, they're tied to real feelings of being left behind. Okay, so let's brace ourselves. The economic impact, tariff shock 2.0. What does it do globally?
The IMF's April World Economic Outlook gives a pretty sobering assessment. They're talking about a kind of double whammy.
Okay.
Domestically, tariffs restrict supply, right? So prices likely go up for consumers. Internationally, demand for U.S. exports could fall as other countries retaliate, maybe put up their own barriers.
Can you give us some numbers? What kind of scale are we talking?
Globally, the IMF cut its 2025 growth forecast down to 2.8%. That's down from 3.3% projected for 2024.
That's a noticeable dip.
It is. And look at China specifically. As of late April, their average tariff on U.S. goods hit, wait for it, 146%.
146.
Yeah. Makes U.S. stuff incredibly expensive over there. And J.P. Morgan's data shows that even though some trade is rerouting, through Vietnam or Mexico to try and dodge tariffs, consumer prices are still climbing.
So the workarounds aren't really solving the price issue?
Not entirely. And the IMF adds another warning, just the uncertainty around all this could shave another 0.3% off global output by 2026. The big takeaway seems to be this second round feels potentially more disruptive, maybe more permanent than the first one a few years back.
Right. A bigger, longer drag on the economy. Okay, let's pivot now to something completely different, almost out of left field. Pope Leo XIV, an American pope. How did that happen, and what does it mean geopolitically?
Well, the election of Cardinal Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, was surprisingly fast. The American part is obviously a big headline.
But there's more to it.
Definitely. His deep connections to Latin America, years in Peru, working closely with Pope Francis, that's also really significant. Many Vatican watchers think the Cardinal's choice reflects a couple of things.
Like what? Demographics?
Partly, yes. The U.S. is the fourth largest Catholic population globally? So an American pope acknowledges that reality. But the diplomatic angle might be even more interesting.
Go on.
Some insiders are suggesting it's a strategic move, a way to actually engage with American nationalism rather than just push against it, especially where that nationalism bumps up against Catholic social teaching.
So instead of opposing from the outside, try to influence from within, potentially.
That could be the thinking. Maybe an American pope can navigate those tricky conversations more effectively, find common ground,
A strategy of engagement and the soft power aspect.
Right. There was that funny chatter online about the Vatican dodging tariffs on vestments by picking an American.
I saw that.
But seriously, Pope Leo XIV, with his background, could potentially be a unique kind of mediator on huge global issues. Things like migration, climate change, even China policy. His voice might just carry more weight in Washington because he's American, understands the context.
Fascinating. A really unexpected piece in this whole puzzle. So let's try and pull these threads together now. The protectionism, the nationalism, this new pope. What are the potential long-term scenarios?
Our first source really hammers this home. These 2025 tariffs. They're not just temporary friction. They risk serious long-term decoupling from major economies.
Which means?
Could mean sticky inflation for a long time, fundamentally reshaped supply chains, more fragmented, probably less efficient, maybe more fragile.
And you mentioned earlier this link between economic pain and politics.
Yes, and it's a worrying one. History kind of shows that when economic hardship bites, the appeal of, strongman leaders or more autocratic approaches can grow. Democratic institutions can weaken.
A historical echo.
Right. And viewed against that backdrop, the Vatican choosing Pope Leo XIV. You could see it as an attempt, maybe, to provide a kind of moral counterweight, to try and re-anchor the U.S. in international norms, ethical leadership.
A potential stabilizing influence, maybe?
Yeah.
Now, that second source, the one focused on the tariff consequences, gets really specific about how countries like China, Mexico, Canada might react. Let's start with China. What's their likely first move?
The analysis suggests China will probably devalue its currency, the RMB, almost immediately. They did that before, pretty effectively, to cancel out the effect of U.S. tariffs on their prices in dollars.
Okay, makes sense. But things are different now.
Well, the source points out President Xi is arguably in a much stronger political position at home now than he was during the first round with Trump.
Giving him more options?
Exactly. He could try, say, constructive engagement, maybe offer more action on things the U.S. cares about, like fentanyl precursors flowing out of China.
Hey.
Or he could dangle the idea of a Phase 2 trade deal, but deliberately drag out the talks. Maybe wait and see what happens in the 2026 U.S. midterms.
And you mentioned China could get tougher, too.
Oh, yeah. If she decides to play hardball, China has quite a toolbox. It's not just counter tariffs. They could restrict exports of critical mineral stuff the U.S. really needs.
Like rare earths.
Exactly. They could also use their unreliable entities list more forcefully against specific companies, and even roll out their own export controls, maybe like the U.S. Foreign Direct Product Rule, hitting tech trade hard. The point is, they can be very targeted, inflicting pain on specific U.S. sectors without necessarily starting a full-blown, all-out trade war.
Very calculated, potentially very damaging. What about the neighbors, Mexico and Canada? How do these tariffs hit them?
Well, the analysis suggests their initial reaction is probably hoping it's all just tough talk, negotiation leverage.
But the reality could be harsh.
Very, especially for the auto industry. Under USMCA, parts cross the border back and forth multiple times. A 25% tariff, that gets slapped on again and again, compounding the cost.
Meaning higher car prices, job losses.
Almost certainly, yes, in all three countries, and negotiating their way out is tricky.
How so for Mexico?
Mexico's in a tough spot. The whole issue with drug cartels being so intertwined with parts of the political system, it makes it incredibly hard for them to fully deliver on Trump's demands, say, on stopping fentanyl in a way that would actually satisfy him.
Even if they try.
Right. President Sheinbaum might make genuine efforts, but her actual power to completely halt fentanyl flows is limited. So there's a real risk of punitive tariffs being slapped on anyway, maybe more for show than results.
And Canada, you mentioned their oil exports.
Yeah, Canada's vulnerable there. A lot of their trade surplus with the U.S. is crude oil. But the catch is, some U.S. refineries are specifically set up for Canadian crude, and the pipelines are fixed.
So neither side has much flexibility.
Pretty much. Canada doesn't have easy alternative buyers. Those U.S. refineries don't have easy alternative suppliers. It's a kind of mutual dependency. Tariffs there would just hurt both sides.
So the bigger picture is strained relationships.
Definitely. It risks really souring relations, undermining the whole USMCA agreement just as it's coming up for review in 2026. That comment by Robert Lighthizer, "No deal is forever," that really hangs in the air. It underscores how fragile things feel.
Even decades-old trade partnerships feel shaky. Okay, zooming back out one last time, what are the wider geopolitical and economic takeaways from this potential shift, according to that second source?
Well, the U.S. is still obviously a huge economic power. But going it alone like this, it risks pushing away the very allies you'd want for things like friendshoring, building reliable supply chains with partners.
So it could backfire, undermine the goal.
Paradoxically, yes. It could actually speed up the fragmentation of global trade and ultimately maybe even weaken U.S. influence over time.
Which is kind of the opposite of America first, isn't it? Trying to be strong by potentially weakening your network.
It seems counterintuitive, yeah. And meanwhile, China's playing a longer game, trying to reduce its dependence on the U.S., building stronger ties elsewhere, global south, even with U.S. allies. Look at their renewed interest in joining that big Pacific trade deal, the CPTPP.
Positioning themselves as the reliable trade partner while the U.S. turns inward.
That looks like the strategy. Now, are there any brakes on this tariff train within the U.S. itself?
Good question.
The analysis points to maybe two big ones: the stock market and inflation. If markets tank hard, or if consumer prices suddenly spike, that could create enough political heat back home to force a rethink.
So domestic reaction could be key.
Could be. Ultimately, these next few months, they're going to tell us a lot. Is this a real long-term lurch towards economic isolationism, or is it high-stakes poker? The stakes are incredibly high for everyone.
Okay, so we've journeyed through quite a landscape today. Internal U.S. political shifts, whispers of democratic fragility, this America First resurgence, and the global pushback, the economic tremors from Tariff Shock 2.0.
The wild card of an American pope and the Vatican's possible strategic play, and then the ripple effects, how China, Mexico, Canada are likely bracing themselves.
Yeah, and pulling it all together, you really do see this picture emerging, don't you? A potentially fragmenting world order, protectionism changing the rules, nationalism rising in different flavors globally.
And even the papacy seemingly making strategic moves in response. The long-term fallout could be serious economic disruption or real shakeup of alliances.
It leaves you wondering about the strength of the systems we rely on. So the final thought for you, our listener, to chew on is this. Can the counterweights, we talked about the courts, alliances, maybe even the influence of the papacy, can they really hold against these powerful, fragmenting forces?
And who else might step up? What unexpected actors or events could shape this new era we seem to be entering? Definitely something to keep thinking about, its impact on global stability and, yeah, on your own life too.